All right, well, it looks like several people have joined, so we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the third day of the Digital Archiving Virtual Exchange. My name is Sarah Preby, and I am a Program Associate with the Public International Law and Policy Group. I will give a brief introduction and overview of the agenda today, and then hand it off to my colleague, Sarah Case, to discuss some logistics. The Digital Archiving Virtual Exchange is part of a project focused on identifying gaps in existing resources and knowledge on digital archiving, expanding this existing knowledge, and offering opportunities for exchange between CSOs across diverse contexts, such as this virtual exchange that we've had this past week. This event is being hosted by the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation, a consortium of 9 global organizations that works alongside communities to amplify the voices of survivors and inspire collective action in countries struggling to confront human rights violations. The Digital Archiving Project is implemented with 5 partner organizations who are all here today. Humanitarian Law Center, or HLC, headquartered in Serbia, Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala, or FAFG, headquartered in Guatemala, Documentation Center of Cambodia, or DCCAM, headquartered in Cambodia, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, or ICSC, headquartered in New York, and the Public International Law and Policy Group, or PILPG, headquartered in Washington, D.C. We've had a great couple of days so far. Thank you to everyone who's been attending, and welcome to anyone who this is your first day. On Tuesday, we heard about the role of digital archiving in justice and reparations. And yesterday, we heard about some of the challenges and best practices of digital archiving. Today, we will have Veronica Torres and Selena Flores as keynote speakers and a panel on advancing memorialization and education through digital archives in post-conflict contexts. After a short break, this will be followed by a plenary discussion where we will have the opportunity to discuss key takeaways and lessons learned. And now I will hand it over to my colleague Sarah Case from ICSC to discuss some of the logistics of the event today.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Sarah Case, another Sarah, and for those of you I haven't met, I'm a senior program manager with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. I'd like to second Sarah Preby and welcome all of you here today. I'm going to go through a few logistics before we get started, and I apologize if you've heard these already since it is our third day, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So first of all, as I'm sure that you've noticed, we have interpretation available in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic throughout today's session. Because we are working with interpretation, I'd like to remind everyone to please try to speak loudly, clearly, and slowly for the sake of our interpreters. As I think you all also know, this event is by invitation only, so we're asking that you please don't share the Zoom link that you've received on social media or with anyone outside of your organization. If you've not already done so, please make sure that your name, as it appears here on Zoom, shows your first and last name so that we're aware of who's here with us in today's discussion. As mentioned, it is an invitation-only event with civil society organizations, victims associations, and other key stakeholders who are all actively engaged and interested in digital archiving in relation to human rights violations and transitional justice. So we want everyone to feel free to exchange their experiences and speak freely. In terms of the format of the event, as you can see, we're hosting this as a regular Zoom meeting, not as a webinar. And this is because we really do hope it will be an exchange between people from different contexts. But we do have some recommendations in relation to that, just to make sure that everything goes as smooth as possible. So firstly, we would ask that when you're not speaking, you please make sure to mute yourself. And then during the panel discussion and keynote speech, I would recommend that you switch to speaker view which you can do by selecting the view option, which should be in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to make use of the chat function, as I see many of you have already, to pose questions, to exchange with each other throughout the event. And if you do run into any issues, perhaps with interpretation or a technical issue, you're welcome to contact our colleague Vladan from the Humanitarian Law Center, whose name here appears as HLC Support. Lastly, I'd like to note that we will be recording today's sessions, and we may share portions of the recordings of the panelists and the keynote, but we won't share anything from the Q&A sessions or the more interactive discussions publicly. So if you have any questions or concerns about that, you're welcome to contact us. Before we move on to our keynote, I just want to check to see if there are any questions about the logistics of the event. You can raise your hand in your video or using the raise hand function on Zoom. I'm checking, I don't see any hands raised at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and continue. Oh, was there a comment from someone? I thought I heard something. Okay, I don't think so, so we can go ahead and move on to our keynote. In that case, I'm delighted to introduce our two keynote speakers for today, both from Memoria Abierta, which is one of our international coalition of sites of conscience member sites based in Argentina. I'll give a quick introduction to our two speakers. So first, Veronica Torres is the executive director of Memoria Abierta. Veronica holds a degree in philosophy from the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters of the University of Buenos Aires and a PhD in human rights from the National University of Lanús. She was Undersecretary of Communications of the Government of the City of Buenos Aires between 2000 and 2004, and Director of the program Memoria and Movimiento of the Secretariat of Public Communication of the Nation between 2011 and 2015. In addition, she worked in non-governmental areas linked to the defense of human rights. She was the Director of Communications at the Center for Legal and Social Studies between 2005 and 2010, and advisor to this organization until 2017 on issues related to memory. She has written numerous articles in academic and journalistic media on symbolic struggles for memory, truth, justice, and reparation. She is currently the executive director of Memoria Abierta, a national and regional organization that works on memory preservation, transmission, and promotion practices. Memoria Abierta coordinates the National Latin American and Caribbean Memory Sites, or RESLAC, of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience since 2016. Also joining us for the keynote speech is Veronica's colleague, Selena Flores, who's the Archives Department Coordinator for Memoria Abierta. Selena is a professor of history, and she holds a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Buenos Aires. She has been involved in the development of various projects related to archives and human rights in the field of the state and civil society. Selena has participated in projects to survey and declassify documentation from the armed forces and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Argentina. Since 2014, she has been the Archives Department Coordinator at Memoria Abierta. She is a professor at the University of Buenos Aires in the area of contemporary African history. So I'm sure you'll all join me in giving a very warm welcome to Veronica and Selena. So Veronica and Selena, thank you very much for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Vero, estás muteada.
Veronica, you're on mute. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction, and especially thanks for the invitation from the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, and greetings to all of my colleagues who are gathered here today. We did want to present, myself and Selena, we did want to address, rather, this issue based on our experience at Memoria Abierta. We want to present Memoria Abierta's experience to show the place that digital archives have, if we can even speak in terms of digital archives, because we would also like to pose a few questions to all of you regarding these matters, but based on our organization's experience. So in that sense, it might be useful to mention a few initial words, at least, on what our work has consisted of at Memoria Abierta throughout its history. Memoria Abierta is an Argentinian organization that's been that's existed since for a little bit over 20 years, and has been organized mostly to work on matters pertaining to archives under human rights organizations in Argentina. That's kind of the core of what we do at Memoria Abierta. And then with that work, with the archives, Memoria Abierta has been able to carry out further significant work having to do with memory and dissemination. But I just thought it was important that we go back to our core for this presentation. Human rights organizations in Argentina produced documentation starting from the very incorporation of this organization. I should mention that Memoria Abierta is comprised of a series of organizations, human rights organizations, in Argentina. These organizations, again, in the 70s, mostly between 1974 and 1978, were founded basically to resist the last military dictatorship in Argentina. This documentation that they produced, that these organizations produced, these documents are quite varied. In the documents, you can find mail, for example, that the family members of those who were detained in Argentina would send back and forth to state-run organizations, reaching out to their families and asking about the fate of those who were disappeared or detained. That documentation is associated also with the various unsuccessful efforts by the family members and these organizations when addressing official bodies as well as other public non-official organizations such as the various churches, religions. And that documentation also includes various legal documents and legal filings that the family members of those who were detained or disappeared would submit to justice, requesting habeas corpus, for example, and other internal documents from the various organizations, a list of oppressors, or lists of oppressors, and other documents that these organizations created in their struggle for truth, justice, and memory to publicly disseminate facts about their struggles, and also information on clandestine detainment centers from survivors. Well, let's just say a whole series of quite varied and quite important documents and information that over time consolidated into institutional archives and historical archives under these organizations. These archives also account for the repression, of course, the oppression from the armed forces and police forces against a significant part of the Argentinian population and Argentinian society as a whole. And the documentation is from these direct victims of this oppression. So we thought it was important to go back to this because when these archives were created by the various organizations that comprise Memoria Abierta, they created these archives, and the main goal that they had in mind was to seek out information for immediate use. That is, for immediate use at that time. And basically to find those who were disappeared and denounce what was happening, denounce before the national authorities, but also before the various international organizations, and also to understand what was happening. I should highlight that at that time, and I think this is something that really characterizes the way in which archives are created initially, archives on human rights violations. That is, this is the way that, in general, organizations and the people recording these situations operate. Again, at that time, it wasn't about creating an archive for historical reasons. It was an archive for memory reasons. And in fact, an archive wasn't even envisioned at that time, as we know it today. Most of the people that comprise these organizations, that in the case of Argentina were family members of the victims and survivors, what they had in mind at the time was to have an immediate effect and to basically find the people who were disappeared and denounce that situation. So the concern at the time to create an actual archive for history reasons and for memory reasons, that only came much later, many years after the fact, many years after having begun as organizations. And at one point, the organizations under Memoria Abierta learned of the importance of the documentation that they had accumulated over time, and the files and archives that they had created from that work that they initially did to gather information and reconstruct the events and document the events. So I thought that was an important point to highlight. The other important point that I should highlight is that, well, just as initially the efforts were being made to resolve the situations at the time without thinking of an archive, and of course at that time all of that information was denied by the authorities, human rights organizations at that point were compelled to move on into an archive, an effort to create an archive, because they found that was a way to establish the truth about what was happening. Because this was, in fact, the truth, and it is still the truth today in terms of the position that the responsible parties assumed under the justice process. So it was a truth denied. So this initial concern, let's say, focusing on the search for information, like I was saying, was subsequently supplemented by this second concern having to do with creating awareness about the value of the archives, and also becoming aware of the importance of this archive for its many uses, its many possible uses that initially was not envisioned. So I think I should also mention at this point that at this second period, this second instance, we also found an urgency in a specific case of Memoria Abierta. We found a sense of urgency to supplement these archives that the various organizations had built over time, starting during the resistance against the dictatorship, with new documentary documents, especially testimonial documents that would allow for preserving and somehow establishing this memory of the experience of what it was like to resist a dictatorship. That is, on one hand, the experience of state-sponsored terrorism in the case of Argentina and what that entailed, but also to leave the testimonials of what the experience was like in the struggle. The experience in the struggle against the dictatorship throughout its duration, but also the experience of human rights organizations in democracy, in the search for truth and justice, and the search for reparations and non-repetition. So at that point, we also found the need to create or to produce new archives. This was at a different period now, at a different time. And this is the main reason why a central archive was created under Memoria Abierta, which is its oral archive. So, as I was saying, the use of these archives that Memoria Abierta conserves and organizes and manages and provides access to, these are basically the human rights, Argentinian human rights archives, but it also includes many other personal documents and other archives from other organizations that have joined our institution over time. They have had multiple uses. I did want to mention a few of these archives specifically, or not archives rather, but a few of these uses, at least the ones that we consider to be the most significant. One important use, of course, has to do with the possibility of reconstructing the events that took place during the state-run terrorism in Argentina at the time. It's important because the main characteristic of the repression in Argentina had to do with the clandestine nature of the crimes being committed. So this reconstruction of the events through the archives has been key in revealing and determining the main characteristics of repression in Argentina. Conversely, these archives have served as the foundation for several denouncements collectively and individually in Argentina and abroad. Also, these archives have been decisive in working with the Truth Commission in Argentina, in working with the CONADEP here in Argentina, which was extremely valuable in their efforts. And of course, in the specific case of our country, where we have been in a long legal process to prosecute the crimes during the dictatorship, these archives and files have also been key in those court proceedings. I should also mention that these archives have also been key in supporting reparations measures in Argentina for the victims in Argentina, and also in the creation of several policies and regulations in symbolic reparations. Here, we must include everything having to do with sites of conscience or sites of memory. In the case of Argentina, that policy is quite developed. We have a national law for sites of conscience in place for several years now. And it's really important to keep in mind that all this documentation, all these archives have also played a key role. Yes, sorry. Did someone want to speak? Sorry? No. Yeah, most of the scripts that are used in museums and other sites of conscience are also use the archives. And lastly, I would say that these archives have been key as well in everything having to do with education on memory and in dissemination work. Dissemination from official sources as well as from human rights organizations. Memoria Abierta itself has a long history of leveraging the archives under their custody to create several tools, education tools and communications tools and dissemination tools that we continue to use today. And in fact, Selena will be telling you about one of these tools that show what kind of use can be given to these archives as we have done today, as we have done to this day. And I'll leave you with one question before moving on with Selena. We can go back to the question in the end. What is the place of digital in this whole experience with archives throughout Memoria Abierta's history and as I have summarized just very briefly? Basically, the digital aspect to us is a sort of support that has allowed us to produce even our own records. For example, I specifically mentioned the oral archive at Memoria Abierta. We also have an audiovisual archive that was produced by Memoria Abierta. And digital has also allowed us, although I must say with some difficulty because financial resources are always scarce, but we have been able to move forward in a digitalization process for the documentation, for written documentation. And we have made progress in certain preservation initiatives using digital, and especially, digital especially provides us to escalate access to material that Memoria Abierta has accrued over time. And as Selena will also tell you, with these processes, we have also been able to establish certain education, communication, and dissemination tools that by having a digital aspect to them, they have become a significant resource. I could not go without mentioning that in Memoria Abierta's work, digital, again, is a support, but it's also a means that has allowed us to undertake significant action, but it's not an end in and of itself. In that sense, one might say that we have an instrumental relationship with the digital, but this relationship does not mean that it doesn't mean that we can forget our core, our work with the actual files, the actual archives. This is how we've worked over so many years at Memoria Abierta, and I think Selena will dive deeper into that work and into this question. This question around digital archives and whether or not it makes sense to separate the two terms. And also what kind of risks digital entails. And what kind of risk you run when separating the two realms. I'll let Selena go ahead, and thank you once again for this opportunity. Hello, good morning, and thank you. Just so that we don't run too long, I will be sharing a tool that we chose, that we thought would be useful. In recent years, it's the tool we've most used on education and outreach with the various schools, with the children from 8 to 17 years of age. which is in Argentina what we would call middle school. So I will be showing you a resource now that we created a few years ago. And it's a tool on the military juntas that were in place in Argentina. These were the very first trials on these juntas that were cut off, unfortunately, in 1987, but were resumed in the 90s in Argentina. And this is still one of the main pillars for truth, justice, and memory in Argentina. So basically, this tool, and this is where we go back to this idea of rethinking about what it means to run a digital archive. Because well, again, just like Veronica was saying, we are only speaking from our experience. And we, from the very beginning, when Memoria Abierta was created in 2000, it was created with an archival outlook based on science and based on this intent to better organize the archives for archival work and not just process the information. And I think there I should make that first distinction, because sometimes there's a mix when referring to documentary archives and information. Many times when we speak of archives or when we use this concept of digital archives, we oftentimes think of databases with information. We've seen how various organizations can use digital archives for litigation. So it's important to make that distinction between what treating a document is and what treating information is. It's two separate things, and also with two separate goals. We at Memoria Abierta, in terms of preservation and in terms of providing access to all these archives that Veronica mentioned, there we work under the idea of the document itself and not information. We don't process information for research. For research, that is up to the other organizations and actual researchers. We simply prepare the files and the documents so that that work can be done. We prepare these documents and archives with the concept that documents comprise collections or archives that must be comprehensive in their organization. So basically, Memoria started to become a documentation center. And again, there are several examples of this. It became a documentation center that manages and provides access to various document collections that were donated or acquired through several means. In many cases, the other purpose of Memoria comes in, which is the purpose of disseminating and educating. From the very beginning, in 2000, Memoria Abierta was quite closely associated with establishing the first material to be used in education institutions in Buenos Aires. Before then, recent history was not included as part of the syllabus in classes. So Memoria helped to create educational material for the schools that address these issues. So that was the initial use of these archives. And all based on the documentation and preservation work that Memoria Abierta did. It's not that Memoria Abierta went out, found the documents, and then created the tools, but instead, well, this tool is extremely important to us because of how transcendental, how important it was to have access to these documents and to also boost the judicial process. They were quite important in transitional justice in Argentina as well. And they also show, just like Veronica was saying, they also show how Memoria Abierta from the very beginning had this goal of, well, of course, managing and preserving document collections, but progressively, by nature, it became a place where we basically became a document repository for justice without that having been the initial idea or the initial goal. And that's really what I wanted to emphasize. To emphasize how, with this idea of collecting documents, that led to us thinking of how to disseminate and communicate those documents. And that's basically what I wanted to show you with this tool. This is the tool that somewhat explains how the trials took place for the military juntas. So it speaks of the background initially on how the trials actually began, because for Memoria Abierta, it was quite important to talk about the work and the mobilizations from various human rights organizations so that these trials would actually take place. So we start with the background simply to show much of that material that was out there in human rights organizations. So for example, well, this is just one example. This is a document under a specific archive, and these are the denouncements that Veronica mentioned. These claims or denouncements were filed before human rights organizations, and they're also part of this archive, hence the importance of the archive as well. And in this case, for example, this file, this document, and sorry, I don't know how this might turn out, so you're testing this with me as we go. This document, we also have it linked. Let's see, nothing ever works when you need it to. 1 second.
Se ve el catálogo, Celi.
Ese es el catálogo, perfecto.
That's the catalog. Okay, we can see the catalog. Okay, great. So we have associated that file, that document, when I spoke about the document repositories, we associated that file with our permanent human rights archive assembly. That's where that document actually is found. So the idea was to collect all these documents into a single archive, and we believe it's really important to organize the files this way because it also accounts for the history of the events and explains the origin of these repositories so that the information isn't isolated. So that one claim, that one denouncement with a very specific issue, it's a denouncement on someone who disappeared, we believe that it's quite important to associate that document with the surrounding information in the archive around that claim. So basically what we try to do is to always do that double work, so to speak. So we use the specific document, but we also try and provide the general context under which that document was created. So again, this is our catalog. This is our online catalog at Memoria Abierta, providing access to the records under all of the collections that we have and that Memoria Abierta provides access to. Most of the collections we have here were used for the tool that I'm going to try and start up again. It's in the back here. 1 second. It's up top there. There it is. Okay. You can see the tool here? Yes. That's what we did for this tool. So here we have the paper documents that were digitized, just like Veronica was saying, on the importance of digital in producing these documents, especially with the importance of digital archives with the organizations with whom we work. When we say digital archives, these are scanned documents, what we call digital native documents. And this is another digital native document having to do with the actual interviews under the oral archives. At the time, these were done in an older format, but I forget if it's since 2008, I think. That's when these videos were made digital, and these would be our digital native files. And then another important process that we undertook and that we have been progressing on has to do with the audiovisual material from the trials. This is something that in Argentina, the justice process in Argentina is and was a very public process, and the most recent process also had all their proceedings recorded. And again, not with some natural goal of simply recording, but aware of the role that archives have. And these recordings were donated and provided to us for conservation and for digitalization. So we have moved forward in acquiring further documentation and further audiovisual materials so that we can digitize them, especially in the oral archives, to then provide access to that material. Because otherwise, it could not, no one would ever see many of these recordings. This is just a segment of these very important trials that we believe to be extremely important, that they reach the schools, and that this material be seen by these audiences. And working with primary sources is somewhat difficult. But in this case, we found it to be extremely important so that these materials would comprehensively reach that audience. So we did all of that work. We identified and recovered and preserved and described comprehensively this material together with its re-digitalization. All of this was part of the archival work that we have done, that we found key to do when providing this material to the public as a whole. So this, for example, the task that I've been assigned.
No se escucha, Celine.
Well, we cannot hear it, Celine. Okay, you can't hear it. Well, we encourage you to take a look for yourselves. And this is, again, these are the witnesses, testimonials, and everything around the trial. Something really interesting about the documents, and this is something else that we can address when talking about digital archives that isn't often done or isn't given much emphasis, is what Veronica mentioned about the Latin American experience and the specifics in Latin America under the dictatorships. And one thing that's really interesting in terms of all these files has to do with the importance of preserving the originals. When we talk about digital natives, that's quite different than speaking of the actual documents and the actual material in physical form. So, for example, to this date, those tapes from the trials from 1985 are stored in the federal chamber, in the court's files. And we have been trying to digitize that material further, given its importance. And we always emphasize, again, the importance of having really great preservation when it comes to the original documents. In the rush to think about the digital realm and thinking about digitizing, that still has some uncertainty when using digital. We know that paper lasts. Paper lasts for a long time, and technology does allow us to at least improve the way we reproduce those original documents. But that's another focus point when thinking about archives and thinking about the work process to ensure proper conservation, and not just simply digitize and disseminate what's been digitized, but to also consider preservation when managing these documents and handling the documents. This is just a brief overview of what we wanted to share because we found it quite pertinent to today's subject matter. And we know that there are very different experiences elsewhere, but we just thought that it would be good to talk about digital archives, about digital archives in research, digital archives in education, digital archives for memory reasons, And that really brought us back to think, what is an actual digital archive? What are we actually speaking about? And what are we referring to when speaking of digital archives? In the case of Memoria Abierta, digital archives are mostly about providing support and emphasizing the idea of an archive, the idea of comprehensiveness, the idea of preservation, the idea of distribution, and then with that foundation, and again, I know that there are many here who have education on documentation centers as such, but with that foundation, it does allow for creating many tools that allow us to think further about dissemination and education. But we believe that we always have to keep the process behind the scenes in mind. That's kind of a very important foundation to always keep in mind. Veronica, I don't know if you wanted to close with anything else? No, I think really the point, that would be the point. We have time to continue to talk about these subjects. Maybe we can have a Q&A now. I don't know exactly, but what I mentioned in the presentation and Selena mentioned in her presentation really summarizes what we wanted to offer up for discussion today, because we know digital matters are increasingly intense, especially under the pandemic. The pandemic has brought us into the digital world and digital everything. There's been a sort of a digital inflation, so to speak. And with that in mind, we just wanted to tell you about Memoria Abierta's experience, to, again, just to think about the place digital has in our experience. And in that sense, we understand that it is a place that is, let's say, supplementary from a conceptual standpoint. That is, our key work continues to be about how to create work through the archives, and to think of all the advantages that digital, of course, can provide, without disassociating that with the actual issues that using digital entails. Now, it's at times the goal for many organizations, but we understand that that entails a whole series of significant efforts, resource-wise as well, that at least human rights organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I would say most victim and human rights organizations working throughout the world even, and many of whom are found under the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Those are the organizations that not always have permanent resources to support this kind of work. So I think, well, I think there are several things to think about, because thinking about the digital divide in this sense, I think you cannot disassociate that with these other more social and economic processes. So just basically, this is also what we wanted to maybe pose. And I think there's a lot to think about still when it comes to digital archives, especially this difference between digital native archives and digitalization as such, as a separate process. I think there's also I think this also brings up other issues that we can discuss, but there's this idea of digitalization as a resource that somehow democratizes records, given today's technology. When, for example, recording human rights violations, in that case, we believe that these are things to definitely think about. But again, that does not mean that you are exempt from doing the actual work with the archives, with the files, even if they're digital, so that they can provide that context and be understood in that context. That is, all this continues to be work and a challenge when using digital files. And I also think it's important to keep this in mind when working with official documents, because digital files do somewhat remove the focus from those who produce the documents. I think in general, the organizations that we have worked with on archival matters, just like Selena was saying, is part of that comprehensiveness that we have established for our work as pertaining to reconstructing human rights violations. When addressing all the information created by the various stakeholders, and this includes the institutional stakeholders, official stakeholders, those are key. So maybe I would also pose this question to all of you. When working with digital files, and here, when working with digital files, I would also say that official files, government files, should be included and considered maybe in a different light. These are kind of the subjects that we wanted to present, and even return some of the questions that brought us to this to this meeting today. Sarah, thank you very much once again, and to the coalition as well for this time. Yes, thank you. And Alejandra, who's another member of Memoria Abierta, placed the link to the resource if you'd like to see it in the chat. Unfortunately, it's only in Spanish for now, but well, that's it if you'd like to see it. And we also have other resources similar to that available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica and Selena, for sharing your experience from Memoria Abierta with the group. And I think you've given us a lot of really good questions to think about over the course of today's exchanges. I particularly appreciate the insistence on sort of taking a step back and posing this question of, what really is the place of the digital as we're talking about digital archiving, and this insistence on maintaining strong archival and organizational practices before really focusing on the digital. But I think it was great that you shared as well this tool with us, which really illustrates the way in which the digital can be used to promote greater access to a lot of this information, make it engaging to wider audiences, and also, as you mentioned, support sustainability efforts. So I think it will be really interesting to hear others' experiences as we go through today's session in relation to these questions that you've posed. We are almost exactly